The Premier League is the richest football league in the world. This is a commonly known fact. 6 of the top 10 clubs in Deloitte's Football Money League are from England, as are 11 of the top 20. But the gap between the Premier League and the other top European leagues shows no sign of reducing. Quite the opposite, in fact. And this video will show you why that gap is only expected to grow. Revenues, wages, transfer spending, and debt and finance costs. Now these things sound boring, but they are keys to understanding financial power in football. And they are the categories that will guide us in seeing the difference between the Premier League and the other top European leagues. And we're going to start with revenue. Now looking at this chart, the first thing that jumps out is that the Premier League's revenue in 2022 was significantly higher than the other leagues. But the trend is more important. In 2013, the Premier League was already the biggest league, 46% larger than the second-place Bundesliga. Over the last decade, this gap has widened as Premier League revenue has grown 9% annually, while the revenues of other leagues have grown much slower at between 4 and 6%. Now this means that not only is Premier League revenue now double the second highest league, La Liga, but also that this gap only continues to widen. And looking more closely at individual elements within these revenue streams, we find a few interesting things. Firstly, despite having double the overall revenue of the next highest league, the Premier League's matchday income also makes up a higher percentage of revenue than any other league. This serves to highlight one of the big drivers of the revenue gap. In terms of average attendance and stadium capacity and ticket prices, the Premier League monetizes matchday income differentially more than other leagues. Now, it's worth noting that in some cases this is quite deliberate. For instance, in Germany, ticket prices are kept deliberately low to enable more fans to watch games. But investment in stadium infrastructure, most notably at Tottenham in 2022, has boosted matchday income for Premier League clubs. And crucially, this is the first example of how the Premier League's money machine kicks in. The revenue lead translates to higher earnings, increasing the potential for investment into assets such as the stadium, which in turn increases revenues. And looking at broadcasting income, it's a familiar story. Now this table isn't entirely accurate, as it doesn't include broadcast revenue from European competitions, but it does reflect the sentiment. What it also fails to show, however, is that the Premier League has seen upward revisions in every recent negotiation, bar during COVID when deals were renewed without renegotiation, while the Bundesliga, Serie A and Liga have all seen a downward revision in new TV deals. Again, another example of where the gap is widening. And looking at commercial revenue, once again, the Premier League is comfortably ahead. The Bundesliga puts in a strong performance here, but in terms of growth, the German league's commercial revenue grew at half the rate of the Premier League's over the last 7 years. Elsewhere, La Liga's actually fell by 7% over the last 3 years. So, if the Premier League is earning much more, they are also spending much more. But that's where things take quite an interesting turn. If we look at wages and wage inflation, the first thing that you'll see is that the Premier League's wage bill is clearly the highest. But when you look more closely, you'll see that the annual growth in wage bills, or wage inflation, is not too different across the leagues. In fact, the Premier League does not have the fastest growing wage bill. More tellingly, for every league besides the Premier League, the wage inflation over the period of 2013 to 2022 is higher than the annual revenue growth, which is not ideal. Wage inflation should really be lower than revenue growth. For La Liga and Liga, it is 3 percentage points higher, meaning that wages are growing 3 percentage points faster than revenues each year. This is a bad sign, especially for La Liga. The Liga data is, after all, heavily skewed by PSG's enormous wage bill. For the Premier League, wage inflation is 0.7 percentage points lower than revenue growth. There will of course be variations across clubs, but on average this reflects the relative financial stability of the league and the power of those higher revenues. And sticking with wages for a moment, if you look at the ratio of highest to lowest wage bills in each league, you'll also find the Premier League comes out in a healthy first place. The biggest wage bill in the league was only 5.5 times that of the lowest in 2022. This shows the comparatively competitive nature of the league. Although it is worth noting that 2023's figures will change that number, as Luton Town were promoted from the Championship. And if you repeat the same practice, but for the difference between the biggest and the second biggest team in each league, the Premier League remains atop the list. Now, next to transfer spending. And this is where, in the last 3 years, we've seen the true power of the Premier League. Every other top league has seen a decline in gross transfer spend in 2023 when compared to 2020. but the Premier League has seen an increase of 76%, heavily driven by Chelsea. The Premier League's 2023 transfer spend was more than all of the other top 5 leagues put together. Now, debt was our final key category, and whilst the total net debt of all Premier League clubs reduced by 34% at the end of the 21-22 season, those clubs still have among the highest levels of gross financial debt in Europe. That 34% reduction was largely driven by the acquisitions of Newcastle and Chelsea and their respective clearing of debt. 6 of the top 10 clubs in terms of gross financial debt in 2022 were Premier League clubs. And consequently, in terms of interest payments, Premier League clubs also account for 5 of the top 10 in Europe. With higher revenues, though, interest payments aren't always the problem that they could be. So, the Premier League truly is Europe's most financially powerful league, and by a wide margin. But the key here is how that money machine keeps ticking over. Higher revenues are the fuel. They enable larger wage bills, attracting better players. These are financed through higher debt and greater transfer spending, which in turn would be expected to lead to higher revenues, providing yet more fuel for the money machine. Suffice to say, the gap is only increasing with time. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.